The story starts at the capital of the Antares Empire. A huge monster opened its mouth wide and screamed loudly. It crushed people with its paws. There were many such creatures in the empire. The people were dressed in armor and armed. A man sitting on a horse reported that 2 million of their brave warriors had been defeated by the evil demon. Looking at the flags, he added that they would end this, and the demon king would fall at the hands of great heroes. In the abyss hall of the great demon palace, there was a domed, painted ceiling. Alex frowned and screamed that his enemy's evil deeds had come to an end. In the distance, a man sat his silhouette hidden in shadow. The demon king Reifenhardt frowned and rested his cheek on his fist. Cyrus grabbed his brightly glowing sword and screamed that they would destroy the villain, and his death would mark the fall of the evil empire. The king, his brow furrowed, replied that Antares should not be called an evil empire, for it already had a name. Teslin clenched his fist and shouted furiously that the protagonist was raising a devil's spawn here, and by destroying it, they would wipe out all these vicious monsters that had come from the underworld. Reifenhardt smiled and thought that in reality, he had simply taught the monsters human tactics, and that they had been oppressed all their lives, and he had merely given them a way to resist. He placed his hands on the arms of the throne and asked if they had already slain the 4 heavenly kings. The warriors stood in a crowd, and Cyrus replied that these filthy orcs were no match for his sword. The king shouted loudly, asking in shock if even the brave great orc Todd had been defeated. He imagined the smiling monsters and thought that the orcs looked menacing, but in reality, they would never betray a fellow and fought the strong, protecting the weak. Teslin crossed his arms and said with a grin that in fact they were just disgusting trolls who got what they deserved for their sins. The protagonist cried, imagining the troll, and thought that it was too rude to them, because they were close to nature and the spirits of their ancestors. Saint Flint closed her eyes and said that the evil dwarf who worshipped the god of darkness was also called to account for his deeds. Reifenhardt covered his face with his hand and thought that these people were very arrogant, because they considered everyone except the 12 gods and seer to be the spawn of hell. The light mage Jade raised his hand and said that they also overthrew the vicious dark elf. The king's face froze with an expression of horror, and he imagined the face of Cyrus. He furrowed his brows and screamed furiously that they were begging for death. The warrior standing in the distance replied that the dark elf was a demon who had gone over to the side of darkness, and there would be no mercy for such traitors. The protagonist covered his face with his hand and replied that Cyrus's skin had only become a little darker because humans had cut down all the trees and forced her people to flee to the barren lands, and now they were blaming her for her dark skin color. Alex raised his weapon and screamed that he would avenge the fallen with his sword. The king's eyes turned black, and he asked with a creepy smile who would avenge the rest of the fallen. The blonde furrowed his brows and screamed that the monsters would never have gone over to the side of evil and lived their normal lives if it weren't for his powers of darkness. A purple mist began to appear around the ruler, and he decided that it was useless because they couldn't hear him. As Alex approached him, he thought about how for them, any non-human species that did not agree to live the life of a slave immediately became a servant of darkness, and this was a suitable reason for extermination. His long hair rose into the air. Then he stretched his arms out to the sides and screamed shrilly that in this case he would become the king of demons that they so wanted to see him as. The enemies flew into the air. Reifenhardt frowned, his eyes shining brightly. He created a magical seal in front of himself and thought about how people did not want to recognize other intelligent races as equals. The king imagined 2 elven girls in maid costumes and thought that these creatures were servants for people who were just lucky to live a little longer than people. Then he imagined a dwarf and thought that they were a labor force for people, especially useful in the mines, and orcs were nothing more than draft horses. The protagonist imagined glass vials and concluded that people used trolls as components for healing potions. He remembered looking at the ruined city and thought that he was deeply impressed when he discovered their culture and its roots. He stood surrounded by orcs, whom he got to know better. 3 monsters showed the mage a yellow glowing ball. He was revealed the magic of spirits from the elves and trolls. Reifenhardt closed his eyes and smiled. He became the first mage of the 10th circle in history with this knowledge. He spread his arms in benevolence. He just couldn't continue to watch how humans treated other races. So he began to help them. His territory was expanding, and it was becoming more and more difficult to deceive people. The king watched the fight between the knights and the monsters. Then the attacks began, destroying structures, plundering lands, forcing them to flee further and further. He sat on the throne, thinking about how they then began to fight back, and somehow everything led to the expansion of their lands, until they turned into the Empire of Antares. Representatives of the various races raised their hands in victory. Tall buildings were visible. The protagonist thought that he did not hate people. He simply believed that other species were no worse than humanity, and no one was going to oppress people in return. Killed monsters lay on the ruins of the building. Everything turned out differently because people did not like their desire to live in peace on their land. The troll with a wound on his head opened his eyes wide. The king thought that his army consisted mainly of orcs and goblins, who were not distinguished by beauty, but it was unacceptable to kill them for such a stupid reason. The protagonist raised his hand and shouted that if the laws of people allowed senseless killings, then he would abolish them and create new ones. Blood splashed out of Alex's mouth. He flew back. Tessalon turned around, looking at his ally lying on the floor, and the ruler said that they lacked skill in both magic and with a sword. He frowned thin eyebrows and thought that Alex could do many things, but overall, he was quite weak. The martial arts king clenched his fist furiously as lightning bolts coursed through his body. He was known for his physical strength. His body emitted bright flames, and Reifenhart thought that the others were easy to defeat. But this opponent was different. The muscle man rushed towards the enemy. He slammed his fist into the ground, but the protagonist managed to jump back. Tessalon rushed towards him. From outside, a powerful explosion could be seen thundering from a high tower. The ruler was standing on the roof. His gaze was tense. The martial arts king jumped, swinging his fist. Reifenhart turned around and clenched his teeth. The muscle man, whose eyes turned white, shouted loudly that victory would be theirs. His fist landed on the mage's head, causing him to cry. Tessalon raised his hands and said that this was expected. The protagonist, whose face was bleeding, thought that his back was broken and that he needed to kill the enemy. But in this state, there was no chance of victory. As he rubbed his head, the martial artist shouted that he would send his opponent to a personal trial. The mage looked at him and admitted that he had won. Tessalon furrowed his brows and suggested that they were all now free of his evil spell. The protagonist frowned tensely. He clenched his teeth tightly and thought that he was going to give up, but he couldn't. The wind blew through his hair and clothes while he marveled at how his enemy thought that monsters should live a normal life of slavery. He grabbed the powerful artifact he found in the ancient ruins. The jock furrowed his red brows and asked loudly what Reifenhart was going to do. His face twisted in rage, and he replied that he was going to cast the regression spell that would turn back time and disrupt the divine plan. Winds swirled around the mage, and he thought that he didn't know if it would work, but he had nothing to lose. The martial artist rushed towards his enemy. He picked up the artifact and thought that he could not allow himself to die. The tense face of the jock lit up. The protagonist narrowed his eyes from the brightness. Tessalon's fist approached the artifact, and Reifenhart screamed loudly. A blinding flash was visible in the Antares Empire. The enemies collided, emitting red and yellow light. A loud explosion thundered, accompanied by a white flash. Birds were sitting on the branches of a tree. Smoke was coming out of a wooden house. The wind was blowing white curtains. The guy opened his eyes slightly, not understanding if he was alive. His body was in good physical shape. He thought that he really managed to use the spell that he had not deciphered even half. He looked out the window and said that a jump in time had occurred, but he did not remember this place in his past. He scratched his ear, wondering how old he was now. In front of a small house in a hollow stood an axe. The protagonist stepped onto the floor. His body was pumped up, and he said it was enviable. He raised an eyebrow in surprise, not understanding whose body he was in. Reifenhart looked at his hands and noticed that they were all calloused, and his body was covered in scars and muscles. He remembered how in his youth the elves pressed themselves against him, admiring his body and coolness. The guy went to the mirror and asked where his chiseled face had gone. He touched his chin and assumed that he had not returned to the past, but had simply exchanged souls between two bodies. The protagonist frowned his red eyebrows and began to study his new features. He opened his mouth and thought about what would happen if he imagined this man a little whiter and with facial hair. The mage sweated when he realized that he looked exactly like Tessalon. He turned around when he heard his name being called. The muscular man opened the door and said that the sun was already high in the sky. He leaned over and yelled loudly, asking why the boy was still sitting at home. He put his hands on his waist and said with a smile that today was another great day ahead of them. Reifenhart turned pale with fear, looking at the huge stranger. He froze when the man approached him and asked why the boy was looking at him so strangely. as if he was seeing him for the first time. The mentor closed his eyes and asked if the student wanted to use the excuse of amnesia a second time. He grabbed the boy by the head. Then, smiling, he dragged him along with him to train. The protagonist sweated when he realized that this stranger was the mentor of Teslan, the strongest warrior of the continent of all time. Gerard smiled widely, closing his eyes. The boy was tied with ropes to a tree, begging the mentor to listen to him. The muscle man gagged him and said that he was talking too much today. Reifenhart screamed when he saw Gerard reaching for the bamboo. His face was covered in sweat. The man hit him on his bare stomach. Tears gushed from the boy's eyes. A red mark was left on his body. He did not understand what was happening here. Gerard dealt the student random blows. The protagonist was crying, thinking about Cyrus. The man frowned and thought that his student's hands were softer than usual today. As he continued to attack, the trainer thought that short-term memory loss was common among members of their clan due to the grueling training. He smiled and thought that since the matter was trivial, the solution was simple. The boy cried while Gerard beat him. He swung his stick, shouting that those who are weak in body hide in armor behind swords. The man approached the protagonist and shouted that it was shameful not to be able to overcome one's weaknesses, and that training was needed for that. The mentor broke the bamboo and shouted that people, like steel, were tempered by blows. The veins stood out on his muscular arm, and he shouted that there were no limits to physical development. Then he closed his eyes and thought that not everyone could become stronger through training, because only high-quality iron became steel. Gerard hit the young man in the face. Beating him without stopping, the muscle man shouted for his student to think about the ocean. Reifenhart closed his eyes and imagined himself with Cyrus on the seashore. He fell to the ground, and the trainer said that training was over for today. The magician hugged himself and thanked God for such a strong body. Stars were visible in the dark sky. Leaves floated in the water, and the protagonist assumed that this was a healing potion. He sat in the bath, thinking that one bottle cost 10 silver coins. Gerard put his hands behind his back and explained that steel always needed to be cooled after forging. Reifenhart looked down and decided that the method was working. He remembered Teslan from the past and thought that he had been through similar training since he was a child. The boy lowered himself into the water and made sure that he had returned to the past after all. The moon was visible outside the window, and the magician mentally wondered where his body was now. He imagined his younger self and doubted that two identical souls could live in the same dimension. He frowned and came to two assumptions. The protagonist imagined two silhouettes and thought that there was he from the future, and he was in Teslan's body, and he coexisted with his current young self. Immersing half of his face in the water, the young man assumed that the king of martial arts was currently in the body of young Reifenhart. He imagined the young magician with a bunch of books in his hands. The protagonist stood in front of a huge plate of meat, and Gerard shouted for him to start eating. While the young man was biting into the piece, the mentor was shouting that the overworked body needed to replenish its supply of nutrients. They were climbing the mountain. The mage had a huge load on his back. The muscle man was already sitting at the top, offering to continue the morning workout. Reifenhart was pumping his abs, not understanding how long this merciless mess would continue. He lay motionless on the bed. Tears were streaming from his reddened eyes. The guy sat in the corner, thinking about how this would affect the future. He imagined the young mage in the library and thought that the uniqueness of the soul is an immutable rule of this world, but it can also happen that the soul will cease to exist. The protagonist bit his thumb and thought that young Reifenhart would be inactive as a mage for the next 10 years. But he, too, was constantly learning, reading books in the magic tower of Delphia. He imagined the skinny guy lifting dumbbells and thought that if Teslan was in his body, then he would definitely come for him. He imagined himself pumped up and decided that the king of martial arts could find a way to become strong in this body. Reifenhart peeked out from around the corner and said that his priority now was to escape from this mental hospital. He quickly ran towards the forest. Gritting his teeth from the tension, he decided that he would definitely escape from here, no matter what happened. Suddenly, Gerard appeared in front of him, who asked with a smile where his student was going. The man touched his beard and said that this was the 9th time he tried to escape. The protagonist frowned and shouted that he was not Teslan, but a mage named Reifenhart. The trainer looked at him with a grin, not believing his words. The guy opened his mouth in shock when the muscle man said that the last time he claimed that he came from another world, where there are gods and dragons. The mage sweated, and the man mentioned a great master from the Huan Empire in the east from a place called Murim. Gerard grabbed the student by the head and said with a smile that he had been especially convincing this time. Then he pulled him along, and the young man thought that he had failed today, but that he would definitely achieve his goal tomorrow. He bit his lip and decided that he would not allow himself to be locked here forever. The trainer looked out from behind a bush and said with a smile that the student reminded him of himself in his youth. Gerard looked into the water and said that he understood Riefenhardt perfectly. He pulled him out of the water and said that he needed to be patient for a little while longer, and everything would pay off. The protagonist was on his knees. He had resigned himself to the fact that it was simply impossible to escape, and the trainer at that time was telling him that there had never been a single student who had not tried to escape. Beads of sweat were pouring down the young man's face, and he thought that if he was lucky enough to get out of here, this old man would still find him. The man crossed his arms and laughed, and the mage decided that it was better to officially get permission and leave these mountains. Gerard beat the student with a morning star. The chains lay on the floor, so Riefenhardt spent 2 years. His body emitted a bright flame. He was able to awaken the aura. The mentor closed his eyes, shouting that there was nothing surprising in this. He took the weapon in his hands and said that if the instincts of self-preservation were developed in parallel with physical data, then the student's will to live would increase survival and also manifest his power, known as aura. He threw the weapon aside and said that they were moving on to the next stage. The man smiled widely, and his fist caught fire. He said that it was time for a sparring match with him. The protagonist froze in shock. A powerful explosion was visible in the distance. 3 more years passed. In the kingdom of Vasily, the Larchen Mountains were visible. A waterfall gurgled loudly. A young guy in good physical shape was standing on a stone. He clenched his hand into a fist. The abundance of his muscles was noticeable. The protagonist's fist glowed brightly. He bent down, preparing to attack. Then he slammed his hand against the stone wall. The boy frowned, deciding that he was not doing enough. Since the 3rd stage was his limit at the moment, he stood in front of the destroyed wall and said that he needed to somehow advance to the 4th stage. He raised his hand and thought that the final stage of the Horn of Calamity technique was a strike that called out 9 waves, and this strike could kill even a god. But even Master Gerard had only reached the 8th stage. Riefenhardt placed his hands on his waist and thought that his mentor had promised to let him leave the mountains only if he reached at least the 4th stage. He looked at his hand and said that in the past, he would have definitely escaped, but now he needed to complete his endurance training. He raised his hands, concentrating magical energy. Then he fired an air bullet at a nearby tree. There was a light black mark left. The protagonist scratched his head and realized that his body was clearly resisting the magic. Suddenly, he looked to the side. He looked at the path from which he felt the inhuman energy. A green foot was visible. The orc came out from behind the tree, holding a sword in his hand. Riefenhardt frowned. Then the orc said, "If you want to live, pretend you don't see me." The youth wrinkled his nose and guessed that this orc was about 3 or 4 years old. The monster looked at him intently, and the protagonist thought that he was hiding from someone. He smiled and asked if someone was chasing the young orc. He raised his hand, and the monster was surprised that the man knew this language. He closed his eyes and admitted that he was being chased. The boy put his hands on his waist and said that he wanted to help. The orc looked at him and said that he could put himself at risk if he helped. Riefenhardt smiled, assuming that this monster was noble, and convinced him that he had enough strength. He raised his hands, and purple smoke appeared around him. The young man pointed to the entrance of the cave and said that his magic would cover the young orc. The monster looked at him and was surprised that he was also a mage. The protagonist raised his eyebrows in confusion when the orc explained that it was strange to see a wizard with such a body. He entered the cave and around, thanking the guy. The jock turned around, hearing sounds behind him. A crowd of people was approaching him. The knight walking in front of everyone asked Riefenhardt if he had seen the monster, and another warrior promised a gold coin for the information. The men turned to each other, and the blond man said with a smile that he would not actually give him money. The guy crossed his arms and replied that he had not seen anyone. The knight saw tracks on the ground and realized that the orc had gone ahead. The protagonist, behind whom there was a stone wall, said that this was his home, which he was not going to let anyone in. Bright frowned, indignant at such words. Riefenhardt looked at the strangers with displeasure, who began to mock him. Then he raised his hand and created a huge purple seal. He took the weapon that appeared in the ground by the hilt. The guy grinned slyly and said that the knights should not be afraid, because they would not die from the blow. He stood above them, and the strangers panicked. Riefenhardt smiled widely. Swinging a club, he fought with the villains. The armed enemy shouted for everyone to attack the jock together. While the protagonist was beating the enemies, he thought that they were still mercenaries who earned their bread with a sword. Suddenly, someone hit him on the back. The enemy's sword bent. The protagonist threw the enemy back, surprised at how his body was damaged by the blade. He swung the club, thinking that he had nothing to worry about because they would not die from such an attack. The mercenaries were spitting, screaming loudly. Only one enemy remained standing, while the rest lay on the ground and begged for mercy. He approached the guy and demanded his name. Reifenhardt hit him and said with a smile that it was unfair that he was still standing, while his friends were already praying to the ancestors. The knights walked away. The protagonist looked at the broken club and thought about getting his own students, so that he would have someone to beat. He turned around when the orc thanked him. The monster placed his hand on his chest and said that he would not forget this, and would definitely repay this kindness. He bowed, saying that Reifenhardt was now his life mentor. While the monster swore, the guy thought about how in orc culture, a life mentor is someone they honor. The protagonist almost said the name Teslin when the orc asked him. Then he stopped himself and touched his chin. He smiled and said that his name was Reifenhardt. The monster, whose hair was fluttering in the wind, said that he would remember this name. The guy put his hand on his waist, asking where his new acquaintance would go, and he answered that he wanted to find a safe place for himself or become a free wanderer. The jock imagined the protruding bones of wild animals and told the monster to go to the land of trials, where the orcs of the Blue Bear tribe hide. The monster ran away. The protagonist crossed his arms and asked what his new friend's name was. The orc turned around and shouted that his name was Todd. Reifenhardt froze in shock, his mouth open. A sword hung on the monster's back. The boy imagined Tahit in his past life, who was the head of the Blue Bear tribe, and later led all the orcs on the continent. He scratched his temple with a smile and thought that fate was involved here, because the real Teslin would hardly have extended a helping hand to an orc. He watched the monster leave. A smile appeared on his face. He remembered how representatives of different races raised their hands in honor of the Antares Empire. Then Reifenhardt imagined Tahit with a huge skull on his shoulder. After that, he thought of a troll with blue skin. He remembered Cirrus. Then the protagonist imagined a dwarf. King Antares sat on the throne, smiling widely. He imagined himself surrounded by different races, his friends and his family. Near the mountains there was a frozen lake. Half a year had passed since that strange meeting with Tahit. Gerard swung his burning fist. A huge stream of air bullet energy rushed forward. The protagonist raised his hands and declared that this was too much. He had to jump back and use Vortex Guard to dodge. The man crossed his arms and praised his ability. The old man remembered how his student lost his memory and called himself by another name. Reifenhardt put his hands on his waist and asked why he needed to remind him of something that happened 6 years ago. The mentor scratched his beard and said that his friend had become much stronger since he began his training 10 years ago. The martial artist looked at him puzzled and asked why he was still so small. The boy asked what that meant since he was almost 2 meters tall. The teacher clenched his fist furiously and shouted that a member of the indestructible training hall must exceed 2 meters. Gerard put his hand on the student's head and asked if he was sure he was following the breathing technique correctly. The boy thought about how the Teslin from the past was actually taller and replied that physique was not that important. The warrior looked away and thought about how he wouldn't be able to fit through any doorway if he started breathing like he was taught. The man concluded that his friend was strong enough. The fighter clenched his fists. The old man declared that it was time for him to show all his abilities. The protagonist's eyes lit up. His body soared into the sky. Reifenhardt extended his arm to the side and used the horn of distress. The boy swung his fist and rushed towards the ground. His blow was accompanied by the release of a huge amount of energy. The ice broke into pieces and the water splashed. The shockwave rolled across the entire lake. Blocks of ice rose high into the air. With his mouth wide open, the mentor laughed and called it an excellent attack. The young man looked at his hand and realized that he had reached the 4th stage. The martial artist concluded that now he would definitely not be easy to defeat. Standing on the rock, Gerard said that now he would have to go to the outside world. The man narrowed his eyes and praised his student for his excellent work. The warrior gaped in surprise. The old man asked him to live as his friend saw fit and explained that he did not care whether he became a hero or a villain. The mentor closed his eyes and said that this was a reward for all his efforts. The fighter frowned sadly. The martial artist frowned and remembered something his teacher had told him 60 years ago. Rastal raised his index finger and said that earning money was good, but he should not participate in dishonest affairs. Kneeling, young Gerard asked what this meant, said that his mentor did not mind him becoming a villain. The martial artist explained that even villains should be honorable. The man raised his second finger and asked him to advocate for those who were treated unfairly, because he should be valued and respected by those around him. The boy asked if he was talking about the weak. The teacher explained that weakness is not always a consequence of unfair treatment, so one must learn to distinguish between the two. Rastow raised his third finger and stated that the third rule was the most important. The old man raised 3 fingers and asked his student to spread the teachings of the unbreakable training hall to the masses and make sure that it would not be interrupted. Standing in front of his friend, the mentor urged him to find a student to inherit their great techniques. The protagonist stated that he would keep this in mind. The martial artist tossed him a bag and explained that finding a talented student was not that easy and could take almost a lifetime. But this was an opportunity that should not be missed. Reifenhart looked at the bag and noticed that it contained 30 pieces of silver. Frowning, the boy said that he thought his teacher had become rich in the kingdom of Vasily and asked if he did not have his own estate in the capital. Gerard replied that the payment for completing the training was set by the clan. The man handed his comrade a scroll and said that he had prepared a small gift for him in the Settlard Mountains and added that there was a mark on the map. The young man opened the map and the old man asked him to be sure to look there if he was nearby. The warrior walked out into the icy mountains. The fighter looked back and wondered if he really had complete freedom now. Snowflakes swirled in front of him in the gusts of wind. Suddenly, there was an explosion behind him. The protagonist opened his mouth in shock and screamed. The mentor raised his fist and urged his student to carry on with his steely determination without hesitation. The martial artist grinned and called him the heir to the greatest techniques in this land. Reifenhart ran away. The sun was shining on the city. A local resident raised his hand and said that it was too dangerous. The mayor explained that he had to say what needed to be said. With his hand on his sword, the knight asked what had happened. The old man approached him and asked him to pay for the food. Throwing him a coin, the man mentally called him selfish and decided that this should be enough. The tavern owner looked at the coin in amazement. The swordsman grinned and suggested that he was seeing a ducat for the first time in his life. The local asked for forgiveness and said that it was too little. The warrior opened his mouth wide and asked if he really thought they didn't know the market prices. The nobleman hit the headman in the face and called on him not to dare insult him. The peasants frowned angrily and thought that these were not knights, but real bandits, since they had occupied their houses and eaten all their supplies for only 1 ducat. And that didn't include delivery services and other errands. Someone grinned and asked what had happened. The man replied that everything was fine. Stefan came down the stairs and said that this was exactly why you can't be nice to peasants. The boy narrowed his eyes slyly and said that they didn't know their place at all. In the past, the protagonist was lying on a bed with his lover. Reifenhart smiled and asked why she kept caressing him. Cirrus replied that she just wanted to. The girl stroked his chest and explained that his features were sharp and chiseled like a fine blade. Looking at his reflection in the mirror, the guy realized that his body now looked completely different. The young man crossed his arms over his chest and was glad that at least he had become taller than he was. The warrior looked out the window and remembered that Cirrus was now about 70 years old, which in human years is about 17 years old. People were walking along the streets. The fighter thought about the fact that he was in a city south of the kingdom of Vasily, and the girl would be sold next year at the Chutton slave auction. Scratching his chin, the protagonist wondered what he should do now and suggested that he should just break into the auction and take her. The locals went about their business. Reifenhart decided that he could not act so recklessly, because later it would be difficult for him to restore his magical powers, so it would be better to solve the problem with money. The guy clenched his fist and realized that he had no money at all, and now the prices for elves are simply incredible. Clouds swirled around the obelisk. The young man thought about how he had a powerful body, techniques, and knowledge of the future, and on the way to Chutton, there were ancient ruins. Stefan looked back and asked if his friend had found out where these ancient ruins were. Todd asked him to wait a little longer. The man was sitting in the lotus position and meditating. The boy looked out the window and asked if this was really what they needed. The magician confirmed it. Far beyond the city were the mountains in which his ancestor was buried. Walking down the street, the warrior presented a map and thought about how he had an incredibly hardy body and that a true king of martial arts could walk down the street topless even in winter. Frowning menacingly, the fighter realized that artificial return was a special technique of all times, which allowed him to revive memories in any period of time, and remembered that one magician from the Tower of Delphius told him about these ruins. The protagonist smiled and imagined how, in a past life, he found real treasures and sold them for more than 2,000 gold. Reifenhardt stopped. At the foot of the mountain was the village of Kittel. People gathered in the building. The headman asked what they should do now and reminded that they should not even approach the spreading his arms. The man explained that the knights needed a guide and said that they knew perfectly well what would happen if they refused. The local gritted his teeth and cursed the nobles. His friend asked him to be quiet so that they would not hear anything. Taking a bow and arrows in his hands, Ted called himself the most suitable candidate and said that he knew the mountains better than anyone in the village. His wife and daughter hugged him and cried. He himself did not really want to go on this mission. The villagers frowned and whispered that they believed in their comrade. The man thought that now he did not want to go there even more. The protagonist pressed his face to the glass and said that he could go there himself. The villager pointed his bow at him and asked who he was. Reifenhardt replied that he was just passing by and accidentally overheard their conversation. The locals surrounded him and asked if he knew the mountain road. The guy said that he had been there many times. The old man explained that no one who had been to the Valley of Death had ever returned from there. Grinning, the young man repeated that he had already been there and thought that they should have simply thanked him. In the center of the Valley of Death stood an obelisk. It was a dungeon that served as a reminder of the Silver Age. Claude thrust his sword into the ground. 50 years ago, legends were made about him and his adventures throughout the kingdom of Vasily. The knight fell in battle when he decided to go to the Valley of Death with only one squire. The problem was that his demonic sword, Alta-On, which was a symbol of the family, was also left there. The squad led by Stefan moved forward. Lelsia approached him and called him noble. The boy thanked her for such pleasant words. The warrior looked at them and realized that this was his slave, with whom they were probably having fun. Seelan smiled widely. The fighter was surprised that this child could use the blessing properly at such a young age. The saint closed his eyes. The protagonist doubted that there was a boy in front of him. Todd approached him and they began to talk. Reifenhardt decided that he should also try to talk to him. The heroes looked at each other. The boy wondered what kind of atmosphere was between them. The man covered his mouth with his hand and blushed. The young man's eyes widened in fear and decided that this definitely couldn't be true. Edward praised his choice. The warrior looked back and asked if they were talking about showing the way. The knight confirmed this and explained that the villagers were afraid to take on this task. The fighter replied that it was not surprising that they were afraid. The nobleman raised his eyebrows and asked how anyone could be afraid when they were accompanied by brave imperial knights. The protagonist gritted his teeth in displeasure and thought that there really wasn't a knight in the world who didn't like to brag. Suddenly, the heroes looked away when they heard a strange sound. Suddenly, something soared into the sky from the foliage of the trees. Giant birds rushed upward. The enraged harpy bared her fangs. The monsters spread their wings and rushed at the travelers. The commander saw that they were approaching and ordered everyone to get ready. The monster spread its clawed fingers to grab its prey. Raising his sword, Stefan asked how it dared to attack them, humans blessed by Sigurd, and called on his comrades to attack. Todd raised his hand and used fire chains. Waves of flame crashed down on the harpies. Seelan clasped his hands and asked Lord Philonance to grant the soldiers strength and courage. Watching the battle from the sidelines, Reifenhardt decided that this was quite good. Frowning, the boy thought that from the point of view of a practitioner of martial arts, the boy was still pathetic, and decided that at least Gerard never bragged without reason. The youth narrowed his eyes suspiciously. The orcs covered their heads with their hands in fear. The monster flew forward and bared his fangs. The thugs closed their eyes. The warrior struck the monster right in the face. The harpy immediately flew to pieces. The fighter thrust his fist forward and noticed that no one was paying attention to him. And that's the end of this chapter. If you enjoyed the recap, don't forget to like, comment which part hyped you the most, and subscribe for the next episode. See you in the next upload.